Good evening to everybody. My name is Roberto de León. I'm the Deputy Director for International Peace and Security in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Mexico City. And I'm glad to be in this important event with a distinguished expert, Jennifer Trahan, that will share with us her thoughts and conclusions from a recent book, which is called Restrictions on Veto Power in the United Nations Security Council in case of mass atrocity. And we will have the opportunity to receive some comments and suggestions from her in terms of the analysis she has been making on this important topic. I would like to begin, of course, by thanking the legal advisor, Alejandro Celorio, and all his team for organizing this important event that promotes the analysis of relevant issues on international law. It's really a pleasure and an honor to participate in this year's workshop. But before giving the floor to Jennifer, I would like to share briefly some ideas with our audience. Current initiatives on veto restraint in mass atrocity situations and diplomatic efforts to promote them are the response to the inability of the Security Council to prevent and halt mass atrocities crimes in the decade of the 90s. The UN failures during that decade, including the Council inaction in confronting the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica, lead to deep discussion about the future of the organization and how to strengthen its effort to address human tragedies. More recently, the conflict in Syria, where a divided council has been unable to play a more central role in reducing human suffering, have added renewed support to the view that the council needs to do a better job of preventing and responding to mass atrocities. And on the center of that discussion is the way that the permanent members exercise the veto power and the responsibilities enshrined in the UN Charter. We all know that Article 27 of the UN Charter established that decisions on all but procedural matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring votes of the permanent members. In 1945, in San Francisco, this clause was part of the price needed to pay for the creation of the United Nations. From the outset, Mexico has expressed that the veto is not a privilege, but a clear responsibility of those who hold it. And I would like to bring to your attention the Article 24 of the Charter that established the primary responsibility of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. That article also mentioned that in discharging these duties, the Security Council shall act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Since 1945, the P5 have exercised their veto 248 times. And since 2011, we have seen an increased use of the veto in 23 resolutions. The most recent, just last August, on a resolution on the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign terrorism fighters, an issue that has united the Council before, but that was vetoed on this occasion a couple of months ago. Well, going a little back in history, on October 2013, the former French Foreign Ministry, Laurent Fabius, published an article in the New York Times advocating that permanent members refrain from using the veto if the Security Council were required to make a decision with regarding to a mass crime. Since 2014, France and Mexico have joined forces to promote a political declaration on the suspension of veto powers in cases of mass atrocity, open to commitments from UN member states. Currently, this initiative counts with the support of 105 member states. The political declaration welcomes and supports the initiative to propose a collective agreement among the permanent members in which they will abstain from using their veto powers in case of mass atrocities. Other initiatives, like the one of the Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency Group, a group of more than 25 countries, also promote the adherence to a code of conduct for the use of veto, as well as the report of an independent group of global leaders known as the Elders, chaired by former Secretary General Kofi Annan. All these initiatives are seeking to achieve the same results: a more responsible, transparent Security Council. I would like to conclude this brief introduction by saying that for Mexico, the protection of an individual represents a universal value under international law. The next 2 years, Mexico will serve as an elected member of the Security Council, and one of our priorities will be precisely to put the well-being of the individual on the center of the work of the Council. We will continue also to promote transparency and accountability on the Council, improvement of the working methods inside the Council, and of course, on the discussions on the General Assembly. And we will continue to partner with France and other interested member states to promote this initiative to regulate and to halt the use of veto when crimes against humanity and other mass atrocities are being unfortunately committed. I am sure that the presentation of our distinguished guest will spare light on the complex issues surrounding the capacity of the Council to react on cases of mass atrocities. And that is why we are delighted to listen to her presentation. Now, without further delay, I will introduce our speaker, and the idea is for Jennifer to share her thoughts on this issue, and in particular in her recent book. And at the end, it will be my honor to ask her some follow-up questions. Let me introduce Jennifer. Jennifer Trahan is a clinical professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs and director of their concentration in international law and human rights. She has also taught at Columbia University, Fordham Law School, Brooklyn Law School, the New School, and provide lectures at Salzburg Law School Summer Institute on International Criminal Law. She's a prolific scholar, having published 2 digests on case law of the ad hoc tribunals, as well as scores of law reviews, articles, and book chapters, including on the International Criminal Court, crime of aggression. And as I have mentioned already, her latest book is called Legal Limits to the Security Council Veto Power in the Face of Atrocity Crimes. She has served as consul to the International Justice Program of Human Rights Watch, Iraq Prosecution Consultant to the International Center of Transitional Justice, and worked on cases before the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. She has also served as one of the US representatives to the Use of Force Committee on the International Law Association and hold various positions with the American branch of the International Law Association. She recently also served as an amicus curiae to the International Criminal Court on the appeal of the situation regarding Afghanistan and was named to the Council advisors on the application of the Rome Statute to cyber warfare. So as you can see, there's really a lot of experience and work done by our distinguished speaker on these issues, and we are delighted to have you here with us in this international law workshop. Thank you for accepting our invitation and share your thoughts with experts and colleagues here in Mexico.
Well, thank you so much, Roberto, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak here today. It is my great pleasure. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the overview of my book and existing legal limits to Security Council veto power in the face of atrocity crimes. And particularly, I will also, as Roberto did, start in 1945, and then talk a little bit about the vetoes used while there's ongoing atrocity crimes. And again, also the voluntary veto restraint, which the French-Mexican initiative is an important part. But then I will go on to making legal arguments. There's legality problems with some of the vetoes being cast. So if we go back to the early drafting of what became the UN Charter, the drafting was primarily conducted by the US, UK, and Soviet Union at Yalta and Dumbarton Oaks. And there, the Soviet Union was insisting on the principle of unanimity. That's what they were calling it in the negotiations. The UK and the US initially thought if the permanent member voting on the measure was involved in the situation, the permanent member should be excluded from voting. But in the end, the Soviet Union said, no, under Chapter 7, there must be complete unanimity. And this is what prevailed. Despite pushback in San Francisco, we have the famous anecdote that the US delegate said, well, you can tear up your charter if you don't want the veto, and threatened to do so. So, but reflect that the discussion centered around the assumption the permanent members would be the major troop contributing countries. And that was the rationalization why they would have this extraordinary power, which I don't think is how troop contributions are working out today. And of course, there was really no discussion of how the veto might interact with international justice. That system was just in its infancy, with the Nuremberg trials only starting in 1945 through 1946. But even in 1945, it wasn't an unlimited veto they took, because it is constrained by the purposes and principles of the UN. And in 1945, we may not have had such a developed system of use Kogans, but there are early routes to use Kogans even then. So I think it was not an unlimited power, even in 1945. You all know that during the Cold War, there were many vetoes with the two spheres of influence, the Soviets and the US, frequently invoking their vetoes. And in fact, we see pleas from the General Assembly already in 1946, 1 year after the charter was finalized, for veto restraint, a plea to the permanent members to restrain their veto use. And we see a series of these in the late 1940s, leading into the 1950 Uniting for Peace resolution, creating a special mechanism for calling an emergency special session. And of course, the General Assembly has certain powers, so sometimes it can take up measures blocked by the Council, but sometimes not. So we did see it recently creating the XXIM to investigate crimes in Syria, when referral of the situation was blocked, referral to the International Criminal Court. But that's not the same thing, because the International Criminal Court could have been able to prosecute. The XXIM is only gathering evidence and then would feed it into other prosecutions. And we also see under the Charter, the General Assembly has certain limits on its powers. So if we're talking a force authorization, and even a minimal force authorization, such as a no-fly zone, protecting civilians in IDP camps, or humanitarian aid drops or aid corridors, if there's not consent of the host country, even these need a Chapter 7 mandate. So there's certain things that the GA simply cannot do. So it is really a problem when the Security Council is paralyzed by vetoes. So how do these vetoes manifest regarding atrocity crimes? First, let me say, I'm using the word veto as a bit of a shorthand, because measures can be completely blocked by also the threat of the veto. And we have also the parallel problem of simply the political alignment is such that you know there would be a veto. So it's almost preemptively silences other members of the council. So today we're not talking about a tribunal for Myanmar, because everyone knows that would face a veto, so the draft resolution is not drafted and no vote is put. But this is also because of the way the veto operates. So we have these three parallel problems, and I also use atrocity crimes as somewhat shorthand for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Now, how does this manifest? Historically, if we go back to the apartheid era, regarding South Africa, we see US, UK, and French vetoes, and it likely delayed the dismantlement of apartheid. It does not completely paralyze the council. There is eventually mandatory sanctions on South Africa, so it is not their complete paralysis. In 1994, during the Rwanda genocide, it's a little bit different. The same three states do not want the word genocide to be used for fear that it will look like the international community must do something, and they refuse to endorse sending more troops. Now here, it's not the veto blocking measures, but that there really was no will to send other troops. So it is a slightly different than some that we're seeing today. The US, of course, frequently vetoes when Israel is at issue, and my book does intend to cover all veto use while there's ongoing atrocity crimes. China, it seems, prefers not to use an express veto, but a veto threat. Now, it does join in some of the Syria vetoes, which I'll talk about in a moment. But when we look at the situation in Darfur, what we see is while they're accelerating atrocity crimes, death tolls are mounting, and we have allegations of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. What we see is at the Security Council, the veto threat is watering down the sanctions measures. It is delaying and weakening the peacekeeping mandate. Again, on Sri Lanka, it is veto threats because we see very little responsiveness out of the council. And regarding Myanmar, it is primarily veto threats or the knowledge the veto would be used, although we do in 2007 have one express veto. So in 2007, the rest of the council would have condemned the atrocities. They're in a more nascent phase in Myanmar. And when you can't even have condemnation, it's pretty clear the council will not be able to ratchet up to stronger measures. And it almost sends a green light to perpetrators on the ground when their crimes can't even be condemned. So that is the start of the problem. In Syria, we've seen the greatest number of vetoes recently in really distressing circumstances. Again, we have accelerating crimes, accelerating death tolls, and what we see is a variety of vetoes. My book chronicles 14. By now, I think we're up to 16 or more. And we see them, we can group them into those that block the condemnation of crimes. Then we have blockage of sending the situation to the International Criminal Court. Then we have 6 vetoes blocking measures related to chemical weapons use. And one of the things they block is the JIM, Joint Investigative Mechanism, that was attributing responsibility to the side using chemical weapons. They then also block various measures to provide humanitarian assistance. And one really simply has to ask yourselves, is this how the Charter was designed to function? Looking at this incredibly dispiriting set of vetoes. And my book has half a chapter on the Syria and details of the crimes occurring on the dates of these vetoes. The other half is on Darfur and details of the atrocity crimes occurring on the dates of the veto threats. And I want to just draw the linkage that we do on at least one situation, have a very clear linkage between the veto and fatalities on the ground. So this joint investigative mechanism for chemical weapons inspections, when it was initially starting its work, we do have a decrease in chemical weapons attacks. And then its renewal was blocked 3 times. and we have increased use of chemical weapons in attacks. So I think there we draw a clear linkage between the veto on the East River and fatalities on the ground. So what has the international community's approach been to date? It is what I'll loosely term voluntary veto restraint. And we see this first in 2001. It is contained in the report, the famous International Commission on Intervention State Sovereignty report, creating R2P, Responsibility to Protect. Embedded in that report is a call for veto restraint, because of course the commissioners recognize that the R2P agenda can be entirely blocked by the veto, as it has been recently in Syria. We then have a group of, it's called the S5 group of states, which is Costa Rica, Jordan, Singapore, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. And they put forth two draft resolutions to the General Assembly calling for veto restraint, put forth in 2006 and 2012. But after pressure by permanent members and the decision that any such resolution requires a 2/3 vote, not an ordinary majority, this decision out of the Office of Legal Affairs, they withdraw the resolution because it's fairly clear they may not get the number of votes for it to pass. We then have development of what is now known as the French-Mexican Initiative, that initially put forth by France. And here this is very significant, of course, because France is a permanent member of the Security Council, and they're calling for veto restraint in the face of atrocity crimes. As mentioned, there are now 105 states that join this. Mexico has joined in leading this initiative, which we now call the French-Mexican Initiative. And we also have the ACT, Accountability, Consistency, and Transparency Group's Code of Conduct, joined by 123 states. Formulated slightly differently, they call for veto restraint, but they also stress the pledge for all states to vote for a credibly drafted resolution before the Security Council on timely and decisive action to end or prevent the crimes. So for the sake of time, I'll just mention there were other proposals by the elders, by Hans Corell, by a US-based genocide prevention task force. And in my book, in chapter 3, I compare and contrast all these initiatives and discuss their variations. But I will just summarize. In conclusion, on the positive side, we have nearly 20 years of momentum that the veto should not be used in the face of atrocity crimes. And this is joined by nearly 2/3 of the UN member states. And 2 permanent members agree with this because the UK is party to the ACT Code of Conduct and France is also a party to it. On the negative side, these are soft law documents, so a code of conduct and a political declaration are not purporting to create binding law. In my book, I do argue there are hard law legal obligations here, so one should not regard this as such soft law, but as these 2 initiatives are framed, they are set forth as soft law. But probably more problematically, 3 permanent members simply do not join these. And when 3 permanent members don't join, then we do not have veto restraint. So I argue we need to take a fresh look at the situation and look at the veto, which is in Article 23 of the UN Charter, within the context of a system of international law. It is not above all law. The Yugoslav Tribunal in the Tadic case in the appeals chamber tells us this. It is not unbound by law. It is part of a system of international law. And I think for too long, we've treated it as above all law, a simple carte blanche, no explanation, no reasons, just simply unconstrained. And this is not actually the case. So my book sets forth 3 independent legal arguments, and it looks at the veto in relation to jus cogens, our highest level of legal protection. Secondly, it looks at the veto in the context of the rest of the UN Charter. And thirdly, it looks at the veto in light of treaty obligations, such as those under the Genocide Convention and 1949 Geneva Convention. So I'm going to go through a little more of the details on these 3 arguments. I have there in my book, they take over 100 pages. So the full version can be found in my book. But just to say, my first argument looks at jus cogens. So we say the prohibition of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity are at this very highest level. So I say at minimum, it is inconsistent with saying these crimes are protected, or the prohibition against these crimes is at our very highest level of law, but you can have free vetoes, no matter what the situation. So at minimum, this is inconsistent. More aggressively formulated, in some of our situations, the veto seems to be aiding the crimes. It is giving a clear green light to the perpetrators. A third way you can formulate this first legal argument is looking at the ILC Articles on the Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts, Article 41.1. It says there is a duty of all states to cooperate to bring an end through lawful means any serious breach of an obligation arising under a peremptory norm of general international law. So a third way you can look at it is the state using the veto is breaching these ILC Articles on the Responsibility of States. A second independent argument is looking at the veto in the context of the Charter. So remember, the Charter is framed by these purposes and principles. They include respecting international law, respecting human rights, the principle of good faith, and cooperating in solving international problems of a humanitarian character. These are found in Articles 1 and 2 of the Charter. Article 24.2 of the Charter says the Security Council is bound by these. Now, that is the Security Council as a whole, but individual permanent member states are also bound by the Charter. So the P5 are bound because they're states within the UN system. But if the Council as a whole is bound, I think they're also bound in their individual capacities as part of the Council. So if the Council is limited to what is allowed under the Charter, certainly the permanent members can't have greater powers than given to the Council. So they must also act in accordance with these purposes and principles. Now, it may be difficult to, say what exactly good faith requires, but when you're blocking humanitarian assistance and chemical weapons inspections, how is this consistent with international law, with good faith, and with these principles? And in fact, a number of states at the UN have frequently invoked this argument. And in my book, I also compile some of the statements by states at the UN. We have a variety of arguments inconsistent with obligations under chemical weapons treaties, and abuse of rights doctrine, and various states argue inconsistency with the Charter. A third level you could look at the veto comes from the obligations under treaties such as the Genocide Convention and the obligation to prevent genocide in Article 1 and the obligation in Common Article 1 to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. So the ICJ in the Bosnia-Serbia decision holds that this obligation to prevent genocide, it's a due diligence obligation to do what a state can do based on their capacity to influence. So I would argue if you're a permanent member of the Security Council, you have a lot of capacity to influence. And it may not just be on the Council, but maybe in bilateral relations with the country in question. And by the way, this isn't only an obligation for the P5, this would be for every state that is a party to the Genocide Convention, should be using the means at their disposal to prevent genocide. And importantly, the ICJ says one does not have to wait till genocide is occurring, but to prevent genocide, the obligations are triggered by the serious risk of genocide. So anytime there is a serious risk, these obligations are imposed. And it is not just an internal obligation to block genocide in one's own country, because of course they were looking at the responsibility of Serbia vis-a-vis Srebrenica, which is in Bosnia. It is in a different country, and the court makes this very clear. These are external obligations. We have similar obligations created by Common Article 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. It is also Common Article 1 to Additional Protocols 1 and 3. And I know all permanent members are bound by the 1949. Not all permanent members are bound by all of the additional protocols. So it obviously only holds to the extent they are bound. But the ICJ holds in both the Wall and Nicaragua cases, this is a due diligence obligation to try to enforce the Geneva Conventions. And again, there it is clear it's an external obligation. It is not simply to respect them in your own country. I mean, yes, there is that obligation, but also to try to do so abroad. So, you know, anytime there is a serious risk of genocide or war crimes, these obligations are triggered. I here couldn't invoke a Crimes Against Humanity Convention because, of course, you know, this is in the drafting. One can make parallel arguments here, but you have to do so kind of through general obligations and erga omnes because we do not yet have a treaty source. So my book concludes by saying there's actually 3 concrete measures states can take. First, when the opportunity arises, raise these legal arguments. This is going beyond voluntary veto restraints. It is arguing, no, it's not just a matter of voluntary. Yes, please voluntarily restrain yourselves, but this is not working when 3 permanent members do not join. And take a fresh look at the law here. And there are certain legal obligations. And if states can make these, this would really be ideal. And as I say, some have already been making them. And this would make clear that states do not condone this veto practice. And as I say, it would join the statements states are already making. And it could be particularly helpful to elected members of the council to raise these kinds of arguments to try to head off a veto that they anticipate might be coming. Secondly, states could work together in the General Assembly to issue a resolution recognizing some of these legal limits to the use of the veto, that it is not unbound by law, that there are legal limits. Thirdly, the General Assembly could make a request to the International Court of Justice and pose a question request an advisory opinion, a question such as, is all veto use while there is ongoing genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or the serious risk of these crimes, consistent with international law? And simply ask this question to the International Court of Justice. So those are my ideas, and these are steps that states can do. And I hope some of you will buy the book and look more at this. And I hope Mexico, particularly now that it will be an elected member for the next 2 years, can raise some of these issues about how the veto is used, and in light of as well other obligations under the UN Charter. The Security Council has a weighty responsibility, but as raised in Roberto's introductory marks, this is, you know, carries obligations as well, responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And too often we see this simply blocked by the veto. And it does not appear in 1945 that there was unlimited veto use, but certainly by now, if we look at a contemporaneous reading of the UN Charter, the veto sits within a developed system of international law. It is simply not above all law. So I'll conclude here and see if there are questions.
Thank you, Jennifer, for those incredible remarks and the specific issues that you raised in terms of using legal arguments and the development of international law precisely to understand that the Article 23 and the veto rights and power are not not coherent with the rest of the development of international law. This is something very, very interesting, and also the specific recommendations in terms of how to use international law to promote more restrained use of the veto and what other countries can do. In particular, that section, it seems to me, we are eager to look into more details to your book, but that seems to me that the more action-oriented with a specific recommendation in terms how to proceed. Let me, we have a couple of minutes left, so if you allow me, I would like to ask you a couple of questions for you to elaborate further. One of the questions will be in terms of what you were mentioning in terms of the different initiatives put forward so far, the ACT, the French and Mexican initiative, and so on, in terms of the not legal binding nature of them, using a voluntary restriction or code of conduct. And one of the arguments that we have been hearing about this is that you need to have a pragmatic approach, because these type of initiatives will not require legal change in terms of the UN Charter, for example. And you know that that has been also part of the criticism. Some countries that argue and are more interested in the reform, so-called comprehensive reform of the Security Council, but actually they are more interested on increase the number of permanent members, are not also supporting some of these initiatives, because they think that if you discuss an issue like the veto and restrictions on them outside of the domain of the whole reform, this will be problematic for their own interest. So you mentioned that in your book, there is a chapter where you compare the different initiatives presented so far. What are the common elements on these initiatives? And despite your recommendations to use more hard law arguments, what are the advantages in terms of using at this stage the approach of these 3 to 4 different initiatives put forward in the UN context?
Yeah, thank you for that terrific question. So I do think these initiatives have been very important because, you know, maybe 20 years ago, we didn't have this idea at all. So it's very important first, you know, in R2P and then the S5 states, then French Mexican initiative and the Act Code of Conduct. So we've come to a place where nearly 2/3 of the UN says the veto should not be this way. So they have been very, very helpful. And, you know, they don't require a change in the charter, which is very helpful. My ideas also don't require a change in the charter, because I'm saying use the arguments, consider a GA resolution, refer this you know, the matter to the International Court of Justice, because of course, a change to the charter is veto proof. So, you know, I think both the French Mexican and my approach are not trying to do changes to the charter, which I think is very pragmatic. You know, I don't see any tension in working on these, either the French Mexican or my ideas, while there's also additional discussion about the Security Council. I'm a bit cynical about this because many of the discussions, you know, if you require reform to the charter, I think it's nigh impossible. So I think one has to talk about other measures. And it's simply a question, how long do you want to attempt veto restraint? You know, ask, you know, Russia, China, the US, where they are. Are they close to agreeing? I don't think they are. So honestly, my concern is you can push for veto restraint for the next 10, 20 years, and you don't get those 3 permanent members. So I'm suggesting a different approach to challenge the legality, simply out of cynicism. All of our initiatives basically call for veto restraint. They have different, you know, some are slightly different in terms of which crimes they cover. Some we could have a discussion about what is the trigger mechanism. You know, does somebody have to say the crimes are occurring before they are triggered? And we have differences on whether the threat should be encompassed or it's talking the actual veto. Some push for an explanation of the veto. Liechtenstein also has another complementary initiative right now. They would like, anytime the veto is used, that there be mandatory discussion within the General Assembly. And I think all of these are complementary. So I think the French-Mexican initiative works with this new idea of Liechtenstein, works with my idea. So I think these are all approaches. We have some differences. I think the French-Mexican initiative says if a state's vital national interests are at issue, then this wouldn't apply. But I don't really agree with that. I think there should be no vital interests of vetoing in the face of atrocity crimes. Mm-hmm. And the Act Code of Conduct also has a carve-out, and it's only you should not veto a credible draft resolution. And then we don't know what credible is. So both of these do actually have a little bit of carve-out, but they all basically say don't use the veto in the face of atrocity crimes.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. Let me get you back more to this notion of due diligence that you were reflecting on, and how these obligations from different treaties apply collectively to the work of the Council, and in particular to the countries that are state parties to. And you were mentioning also this notion of the threat of use of veto and other aspects of the working methods of the Security Council. Sometimes, they don't, because many of these initiatives are looking to, scale the political price of taking or not taking some of these actions. But even sometimes, because how the system operates, only the threat of the use of veto or other difficulties in terms of the transparency and the working methods of the Council is enough for not a resolution to be drafted or not even put in blue or presented. So how this is analyzed in your book, and what are the recommendations on that side?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, we have due diligence obligations under the Genocide Convention anytime there's already a serious risk of genocide. And, it is maybe in the abstract hard to say what is due diligence. So I find it easier to say that blocking measures is not due diligence. Failing, when you cannot, when 9 members of the Council are ready to condemn the crimes in Myanmar and this is blocked, I do not see how this is due diligence to try to the best of your ability to prevent genocide. And the similar arguments regarding the obligation to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. It is a question whether one wants to send to the ICJ only the question, is it inappropriate to veto during the commission of these crimes, or should you also include the threat? If we look at the nuclear weapons advisory opinion, it suggests the threat can be just as problematic. So one should not threaten to do something if it's impermissible to do it. I guess in my book, I may have used a more aggressive formulation 2 minutes ago, but in my book, I ultimately said maybe the more narrow question is when there's an actual veto. And I had this discussion with Richard Goldstone, who I've been working with on my arguments as well. And we were thinking about, shouldn't you include the threat? But it's sometimes, I think, difficult to determine what is exactly a threat made on the Security Council. It's not made in threatening language. It may be, very understated, but, the permanent member does not agree with certain language. And then you don't know if that's a threat. It might be a threat, if you go ahead with the veto with their disagreement. So it's a little bit difficult, perhaps, to determine what is a threat. But in the end of the day, I think if one questions the legitimacy of using the veto in the face of ongoing crimes, then perhaps it lessens the ability to make threats as well. And then maybe it also gives other council members more courage to press resolutions that maybe in past they would have known, oh, this would be blocked. But if we fairly clear acknowledgements of genocide in Myanmar, coming out of the fact-finding mission, and then the International Court of Justice on the Provisional Measures Order. Why could there not be a Security Council resolution, you know, taking the Provisional Measures Order from the ICJ and putting that in a Security Council resolution? Take these measures that the ICJ has ordered, things like that. So if one attacks the legitimacy of veto use, then perhaps states can be more courageous when we really think there is certainly, I mean, there are indications that genocide has been happening in Myanmar. So we definitely have triggered beyond the serious risk because it appears that it has already happened. So countries, I think, actually could be more aggressive in pushing measures within the council.
Excellent. Jennifer, you have been referring to the case of Myanmar for obvious reasons. And I think there are two elements there. One, information provided by an independent body, the fact-finding mission that was established by the Human Rights Council, and also recent developments in terms of cases presented to the ICJ and also to the ICC in terms of this case. Do you think we will have some more development in terms of what the court may do when entering to the legal arguments and precisely move forward this file with the arguments that are using in terms of, for example, obligation of the genocide conventions, which are required to take actions?
Yes. You know, I know the ICJ is sometimes seen as a fairly conservative body, but in the Bosnia-Serbia case, while I'm, of course, disappointed that they did not find that Serbia had a more direct role, because I think that linkage was there to be made, they did at least say that they failed their obligation to prevent. And the court is quite aggressive in terms of what it says in terms of the obligation to prevent. So I'm actually optimistic that we will have strong additional rulings from the ICJ, who seems to feel there is serious content in this obligation to prevent genocide. And they have made two rulings as well as the obligation to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions in the Wall and Nicaragua cases. So in this instance, the court seems fairly proactive in what is required under these conventions. So I am optimistic we will see some additional rulings, additional positive rulings in terms of strengthening the rule of law. And then the challenge is to ensure that this translates into changes on the ground, of course. You know, it's not simply a good ruling in The Hague or a good council resolution, but the situation is actually improved on the ground. And that is up for states on the council to then try to, as I say, they could have already proposed that the measures ordered in the Provisional Measures Order be put in a Security Council resolution and mandated Myanmar must do these. It would have given added strength to this, and maybe it's something Mexico can pursue on the council because it has not yet been done.
Okay. Let me bring you a little bit back to the arguments in terms of the R2P discussion, if you allow me. And I'm sure that in your book, there's a thorough analysis of these, because I remember, for example, former ambassador of Russia to the UN, Vladimir Churkin, that rest in peace. He was adamant that sometimes not having the veto could trigger disaster. And I think this is something that has been affecting this agenda in terms of this discussion of regime change and what happened after the situation in Libya and the decisions taken by the Security Council back then, and how, in a way, there was this threat that never again this will happen for some of the permanent members that were there.
Yeah.
And after that, there was also this discussion promoted by Brazil and other countries for example, on the responsibility while protecting, which, you know, it was a more honest attempt to discuss what really happened and how mandates of the council are implemented, but at the same time have difficult discussions in terms of how to implement R2P and the 3 pillars, and in particular the pillar 3, when there is not the willingness or the capacity of a member state to take action to protect its population, its own population, from mass atrocities. So what are the views from your side and in your book about these discussions?
Yeah, I actually don't have Libya in my book, but I probably should, because this does come up. So it's basically, isn't the veto sometimes good? Well, you know, Russia obviously didn't think it should veto the Libya resolution, because it didn't veto the resolution. So I think this is kind of buyer's remorse in hindsight. And it really was a question of the scope of the force authorization. And, you know, maybe there has to be more care to carefully crafting what is allowed under a force authorization. I do think there is an argument that what was used perhaps exceeded the extent of the force authorization. But, you know, Russia obviously didn't question at that point, but I don't think the lesson is the veto can be good, but that you have to be careful in crafting force authorizations. And in terms of the veto, all of the situations I mentioned, for instance, related to Syria, there were at least 9 members of the council who had concrete measures to propose. And note, sometimes people misconstrue my arguments that I'm arguing for humanitarian intervention or large-scale military intervention. I'm not. I am arguing for when other members on the council, at least 9, have a plan even to take small steps, condemn the crimes, increase chemical weapons inspections, refer the matters, do humanitarian aid drops. These are not, they wouldn't have prevented all the crimes, they wouldn't have ended the war, but they might have ameliorated some of the suffering and prevented some of the fatalities. So I rest on when 9 of the members think there is a credible resolution that would address atrocity crimes. We should not have the veto when we have either genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity occurring, or the serious risk of these crimes occurring.
Because the other argument that you were mentioning, if you see it the other way around, is that the failure to take some action actually becomes a green light for some of the perpetrators of these heinous crimes.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we are almost at the end of our discussions, but I want to if you allowed me, ask you a couple of last questions, if you have.
Yes.
If you allow me. One of these is in terms of what you mentioned of the role of the General Assembly. You referred to what was the initiative put forward by the small 5 countries a couple of years ago. And there was a very controversial discussions around, procedural discussions around it. And there was this legal opinion that that resolution will require 2/3 of the G8 for being adopted. And so on these recommendations that you are putting forward in your book on, for example, tabling a resolution that will refer to these international hard law obligations that will need to be taken into account before exercising this right. What will be your sense in terms of the threshold needed for this resolution to pass, and how these, with the previous examples, there were different back then, the proposal of the small 5s, but that was a lot of pressure from permanent members to not have action in the General Assembly around that resolution. Yeah. So in terms of tactics, strategy, and the legal threshold, what will be your thoughts on that?
Well, first, the safest course of action is for states to simply take up the arguments, right? So then a state invoking the legal arguments doesn't have any voting, any threshold, and can simply use these. And I think that also moves this debate along. Raise these issues, raise legality questions, and put this always on the table. You're right. So normally one would think it is a simple majority within the General Assembly. And, you know, when I put forward the two measures, either a General Assembly resolution or referral to the ICJ, I think it is for states. I mean, ultimately, I need states to take this forward in the GA. I'm a professor. I can't take this forward in the GA. I need states to do this. And it is for states to figure out, is it more likely that we could send this to the ICJ, or is it more likely that we could get a resolution within the General Assembly, like a freestanding one that, you know, doesn't send it to the ICJ? Because people also ask me the question, well, how do you guarantee a good result to the ICJ? And I said, I can't guarantee. I can say they have very good law in the Bosnia-Serbia decision. We'll have to watch what they come out with the Myanmar, but I can't guarantee. But what states say they can control, and what is drafted in a GA resolution can be controlled. The ICJ, of course, would rule. But in terms of the threshold for voting, I would presume and hope it would be 1/2. But you're right, we do have this precedent where the OLA, and there are accounts that the OLA, under pressure from permanent members, came out with this pronouncement, it has to be 2/3. At the same time, I note that the ACT Code of Conduct, when it's endorsed by 123 states, that's almost 2/3 of the GA. So it is possible now. Maybe it wasn't in 2006 when they first came forward, but you do by now have almost 2/3 of the GA endorsing. So I think these are all possible measures, but ultimately we would need states to take these forward within the General Assembly. A coalition of states, such as the ACT Code of Conduct. I think I was there when Liechtenstein launched it. I think it was in 2013, and they had only 22 states at the initial launch. And then they ultimately grew. So we do need states to take this up and to build similar support, I think, to the Code of Conduct in the French-Mexican, that the GA could undertake one of these measures.
Thank you. You know, this year we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the creation of the UN, and many of these proposals and the discussions were held 5 years ago, around the 70th anniversary of the UN. I was, to be honest, a little shocked that at this time around there was not more for a push. Actually, there's no active reform process of the UN. That has been something in there for many, many years. This time around, we didn't establish the Human Rights Council or the Peace Building Commission, and so on and so forth. Because, to be frank, I think that there are multilateralism is under attack, and sometimes countries are preserving what we have been achieving in the past and not finding more room to move forward the agendas. But as you were mentioned, that's the responsibility of member states, and scholars and lawyers and experts that produce this knowledge through these books are very helpful to trigger discussions and to move things around. So do you think that indeed this is something that's happening, that multilateralism, as we have been seeing recently, is under attack? And also, you know, the UN is being criticized for not delivering what is expected in terms of what populations around the world require. And sometimes we miss the point that the UN is the sum of the political will of members and the legal responsibilities of members, as you were referring before. So yeah. Do you think that maybe in the coming years we will have a better balancing act of to move forward some of these agendas?
Yes. Well, given what happened on Saturday in my own country, in the United States, I can say I'm looking forward to a renewed commitment by the United States to multilateralism. And perhaps in the next 4 years, we can have some of the reversal of the attack on multilateralism, at least in terms of the United States. So I hope we're on a good path, and I have every reason to believe that we will be. But you're right, on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations system, it is appropriate to reflect, is the UN functioning as designed? Is the Security Council functioning as designed? And I've been doing some book launches with Hans Corell, who served as the head of the legal office of the UN. And he made a simple plea. He said, we need to use the charter as written. The veto was never above the law. Hans Corell, who headed the Office of Legal Affairs, thinks my arguments are entirely are correct and right and need to be taken up. And you're right, particularly this year, the 75th anniversary. I'm only addressing blockage in the face of atrocity crimes, but that is a lot of the most critical agenda that the Council faces. And it does bring on cynicism about the work of the Council, cynicism about the work of the UN, when the highest body, it cannot function as designed. And, you know, you look at the situations in Syria and the series of vetoes, and frustration was really at its height, I think. You know, I'm in New York and I do go over to the UN, and I've never seen legal advisors so frustrated. And you saw that when you have a few of the resolutions before the Security Council were co-sponsored by like 65 General Assembly, members of the General Assembly. They wanted to so much put pressure, you know, do refer it to the International Criminal Court. And there was so much support for a lot of these resolutions. And then the vetoes were, you know, brought, you know, really the height of frustration. So I do think there is an open space for renewed examination of these questions, really pressing. You know, I think all P5 should commit to the French-Mexican initiative and the ACT Code of Conduct. And honestly, if they don't, then take them to court. That's my final plea. You know, you can play this off each other. Commit to the French-Mexican initiative and the Code of Conduct. If not, you know, we want an advisory opinion, because it's unacceptable. Because, you know, our pleas of never again, they're coming down to veto use, and measures that others are willing to take are simply being blocked in some of our worst atrocity crime situations. So,
well, Jennifer, those are so important remarks, and we are looking forward to review your book and to have other opportunities to listen to you, and hopefully in the near future that could take place in Mexico and not through these virtual means. But in the meantime, I really want to thank you for having the time to participate in this international law seminar that has been an effort of our legal office for many years to precisely promote discussions around current issues and developments of international law. And, you know, Mexico has been in the front of promoting the respect of rule of law and the adherence to international law as part of its foreign policy, because we require a more predictable world where rules and law matters are applied systematically and not in sort of case by case. Although we understand that those bodies are political bodies. At the end of the day, the Security Council is also a political body, but it's not operating. And that's my big conclusion of what you were sharing with us today. They are not operating in a vacuum. They operate in this international law system, and this needs to be reminded in different opportunities as you put forward in your recommendations. So it was really an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thank you very much. And I don't know if you would like to add something to conclude this.
No, I just thank you for inviting me. And I have high hopes for Mexico for the next 2 years on the Security Council, that maybe you can take up some of the legal arguments and or help within the General Assembly. As I say, I do very much support the French-Mexican initiative and now Liechtenstein's new idea and mine, I think, are all complementary. We're all working in the same direction, and we're trying to not have as many atrocity crimes, take concrete measures where we can to prevent the crimes and not have the veto blocking this. So I think we're all working towards the same goal. So thank you so much for inviting me, and it's been a great pleasure.
Pleasure for us, and please stay safe, and good evening there in New York.
Thank you.